Most gardeners are unknowingly throwing away the single most valuable input their garden needs every single day. Not compost in general, specifically the fresh nutrient loop that keeps soil alive. Instead, they rely on store-bought fertilizers, which create short bursts of growth but slowly weaken the system underneath. That mistake leads to nutrient loss, inconsistent yields, and soil that gets harder to manage every season. Plants become dependent, roots stay shallow, and you end up feeding more while harvesting less. Now, before we go deeper, there's something I started using that quietly fixes a big part of this problem. I use a small 4-litre electric kitchen composter to process daily food waste into a stable, usable form instead of letting it rot improperly or tossing it out. Keeps everything controlled, odor-free, and consistent, especially if you don't have space for a full compost setup. I'll leave the exact one I use in the description if you want to check it out, because what I'm about to show you only works if you stop breaking the nutrient cycle in your own home. What this 2,400-year-old system actually was, and why it worked. Long before synthetic fertilizers existed, some of the most productive agricultural systems on Earth operated on one principle: nothing leaves the system. Ancient growers understood that fertility wasn't something you added, it was something you circulated. Every scrap of organic material, every plant residue, every bit of waste was processed and returned back into the soil in a controlled way. This wasn't random composting, it was a continuous loop. And when done correctly, it created what we'd now call a closed-loop fertility system. Soil didn't degrade over time, it improved. Yields didn't plateau, they stabilized and often increased. This is where modern gardening advice falls apart. Most people treat compost as an occasional supplement instead of the foundation of the entire system. That's why their results are inconsistent. You can buy high-quality fertilizer, organic or synthetic, and still struggle with weak growth. That's because nutrients alone don't create productivity. The soil system does. When you break the loop by removing plant material, throwing away food waste, or failing to return organic matter, you slowly drain your soil's ability to function. That shows up in very specific ways. You'll notice plants growing fast after feeding, then stalling. Leaves may look green but lack density. Fruits stay smaller than expected. Water drains too quickly or in some cases sits without being absorbed properly. These aren't random issues, they're signs of a broken cycle, and most gardeners try to fix them by adding more inputs instead of fixing the system. So, the part most people misunderstand about infinite food. Well, this idea of infinite food doesn't mean you never add anything. What it really means is your system becomes self-reinforcing. Every time you harvest, you're also generating the raw material needed to support the next cycle. Kitchen scraps, trimmed leaves, plant residues, these aren't waste, they're actually the missing link. But here's the catch most people don't realize yet. If you return these materials in the wrong form, you can actually make things worse. A lot of gardeners hear this concept and immediately start burying kitchen scraps directly into their beds. That's a mistake. Fresh organic material needs nitrogen to break down. When you bury it raw, microbes pull nitrogen from the surrounding soil to process it. That creates a temporary deficiency right where your plants are trying to grow. The result? Yellowing leaves, stunted growth, and confusion because you think you're improving your soil. This is why processing matters. You need to stabilize that material before it goes back into your growing system, not fully composted into dust, but broken down enough that it feeds soil instead of competing with plants. That balance is where most people fail. So, what actually works in real gardens, not just theory? In my raised beds, I've tested both extremes. Raw scraps buried directly versus processed organic material mixed into the top layer. And honestly, the difference shows up within 2 to 3 weeks. With raw material, plant growth slows initially. With stabilized material, growth stays consistent, and root development improves almost immediately. The sweet spot is using small, regular amounts instead of large, occasional dumps. For a standard 4x8 raised bed, I mix in about 2 to 3 litres of processed organic material every 2 weeks during the growing season. In containers, it's even more controlled. A handful mixed into the top few inches every couple of weeks is enough to maintain balance. Hydroponic growers can adapt this by creating filtered compost extracts, but the principle stays the same: continuous input, controlled form. Why does this system quietly outperform traditional methods? When your soil is constantly receiving small, balanced inputs, it doesn't experience the highs and lows of typical feeding schedules. Microbial life stays active. Nutrients remain available longer. Water retention improves without suffocating roots. You're not forcing growth, you're supporting it. And over time, something interesting happens. Your need for external inputs drops. Not because your plants need less, but because your soil becomes better at supplying what they need. That's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. So, why did this approach disappear, and why is it coming back? Systems like this weren't exactly banned in a formal sense, but they became impractical during industrial agriculture's rise. Large-scale farming needed speed, uniformity, and transportable inputs. Synthetic fertilizers solved those problems quickly, but they also disconnected people from the natural nutrient cycle. For home gardeners, that trade-off doesn't make sense. You have access to a constant stream of organic material. Ignoring it means you're throwing away your biggest advantage. And once you start closing that loop, you'll see results that don't depend on constant correction. The small adjustment that makes this system sustainable long-term. Consistency beats intensity. You don't need to overhaul your entire garden overnight. Start by capturing your daily organic waste and converting it into a usable form. That's where tools like a compact kitchen composter make a real difference. Instead of letting scraps pile up or dealing with slow outdoor systems, you create a steady flow of input you can actually use, and once that becomes part of your routine, everything else gets easier. You stop thinking in terms of waste and start thinking in terms of cycles. What you'll notice when this finally clicks: plants establish faster, soil stays workable instead of compacted, watering becomes more forgiving, and yields become more predictable. Not necessarily explosive overnight growth, but steady, reliable production. That's what serious growers care about, because consistency is what allows you to scale results, even in a small space. And this is where most people watching this will realize something. They've been trying to fix symptoms instead of fixing the system. Why understanding this changes everything. Once you see your garden as a closed loop instead of a feeding schedule, your decisions change. You stop asking, what should I add? And start asking, what can I return? That shift is what separates average results from high-performing systems. It's not about doing more work. It's about doing the right work. And this 2,400-year-old approach still works today because the biology hasn't changed. Only our habits have. Closing. If you want better harvests, stop chasing quick fixes and start building systems that sustain themselves. Your soil is either improving every season or slowly declining. There's no neutral. When you close the nutrient loop, support microbial life, and feed your soil consistently, everything else falls into place. That's how you move from occasional success to reliable production. If you're serious about growing more with less waste, subscribe to the channel. And if you know someone who's constantly struggling with weak plants or inconsistent yields, share this with them. Because once you understand how to keep the cycle going, your garden stops depending on you and starts working with you.